In the last recording, we talked about autofill. If you haven't viewed that recording yet, you really don't need to. However, you do need to, if you wish, or you will need it for charting, get in some of these data items in here. So let me just undo the last couple things I did here, if it lets me. And what I did to get these to fill in is the 1/2/2012 was already there. I added the 1/9, and then I grabbed the fill handle and pulled it down. This is using autofill series. Notice the dates are going up by 1 week at a time because I gave it an example of 2 dates that were a week apart. And so now I have each week in here. Some of them are in the future, but that's okay. It's sample data. And then I did the same thing with region 1 and dragged it across. In this unit, we're going to be talking about relative addressing versus absolute addressing. This is one of the things I found students really don't quite get their head around after beginning Excel or Microsoft Office. And so I want to cover it and hopefully explain it a little bit better. First thing I want to do is create the totals. How many across the 5 regions did we sell in every week? So I'm going to create a label for total and center that. Maybe it'll look a little better. And then I'm going to create a sum. Remember, a shortcut here, this is not part of absolute referencing or relative referencing. It's just a tip. A shortcut for doing a sum is highlight all the cells in advance. So I'm going all the way down to the bottom. And then if you hit the auto sum button, it adds them up. It assumes, Excel does a little bit of analysis, and it assumes that you want to add the numbers to the left. So I'm going to take a look at that. B5 to F5, yep, that's good. Sum of B6 to F6, yes, that's good. And let's just add some commas to these so that they're a little easier. Here's another power tip. I'm holding the shift key down, and I'm going to press the end key, still holding the shift key down, down arrow. In Excel, to move around between cells, you might have learned this in Microsoft Office, you can press the end key followed by the direction that you want to go, and it will go to the end of the spreadsheet in that direction. So in this case, I hit end down and it went down. In all Microsoft products, all Windows products, if you hold the shift key down while you're moving, it highlights on the way. So I held the shift key down, did an end down arrow, and it highlighted all the cells down to the end. I want those to have commas, but no decimal places. Okay, the little triangles basically saying what? That's different. Let's take a look at what this little triangle, this formula refers to a range, has different numbers next to it. It's talking about these dates that are technically numbers. I want to get rid of those. So once again, I'm going to do a shift, end, down arrow, highlights on the way. And then I'm going to, let's see if I can, remove all those, oops, I put it in the wrong one, that's why. Control Home. Shift and down arrow, and then click on this little guy here and say ignore this error. It's not an error, I checked it. And all those little triangles go away. You don't have to do that. The green triangles don't bother you. Then you can just leave them there. But what I found is if I'm sharing this information with other people, they always want to know what's with the green triangles, what's with the green triangles. It's nothing, it's just Excel warning me. All right, finally the topic of the recording here. Relative referencing is what Excel uses when you create formulas. As you can see, this cell says it has a value 3059 in it. Well, no, not really. What it has is a formula that says sum of B5 to F5. But that's not true either. That's not really what Excel is storing in there. It's what it's displaying to you so that you can see which cells are being used in this formula. What Excel is really storing behind the scenes are what are called relative references. Relative references are relative to this cell. This is where the answer is going. Relative to this cell, what this formula really says is add up everything from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 cells to the left to 1 cell to the left. So B5 to F5. 5 cells to the left to 1 cell to the left. That's really what's stored there. It's not a B5, it's not an F5. In my classrooms, I'll often put something in there like an L5 and then an L1. 5 cells to the left, all the way to 1 cell to the left. What's nice about relative addressing is that when you then copy that formula, Notice how the F6 and the D6 automatically updated when we copied those down, when those formulas were created? Magic, right? Well, no, not really. It's relative referencing. What this says is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 cells to the left all the way to one cell to the left. So it's exactly the same thing, right? It's using relative referencing, and we can go all the way down here and click on this one, and you know what it says? 5 cells to the left, 1 cell to the left, and the formula works. It's called relative addressing. It allows us to very easily copy formulas and have Excel automatically update them. At least that's the way we usually say it, but it's not really updating the cells. It's simply using the relative addressing to use the same relative addresses in the new formula as it did in the previous formula. So that's relative addressing. But sometimes relative addressing gets in the way. Let's create a new column here called percent of goal. Okay. I have a goal here of 4,000, and I want to know how close to that goal did we get in each one of these weeks. And that goal may be a little bit high for these. I don't think any of them, did we get any higher than 4,000? Well, it doesn't matter, we'll do the percentages. Okay. So here's my percent of goal. We'll calculate the percent of goal. We take the total and we divide it by the goal. So that's not too hard. Equals, and I'm going to point to the total and click it. I call that point and shoot. Most Excel instructors should teach you how to do that. You can type the G5, but it's generally much easier and safer to point to it. Then I want to divide by C2. And looks like I need a little bit of formatting here, so let's format these. That end arrow key technique wouldn't work here, by the way, because there's no data down here. But I can quickly do the percent, and I think we'll go with 1 decimal place. So here this says we were about 76% of our goal. That seems right. 3,000 and 4,000 is about 3/4. So that seems to be the right answer. I could check it with a calculator, but it kind of defeats the purpose. And now I want to copy that. I could copy it all the way to the bottom, but I already know that because of relative addressing, this is not going to work. So I'm going to copy it a few times. And notice I get a divide by 0 error, then I get a value error, and then I get some very huge, this cannot be 400% of 2,000. Right? Something's wrong here. We got to figure out what's going on. What's wrong? Well, relative addressing has done us a disservice here. If we look at this formula, this one says what? It says take 1 cell to the left and divide it by 1, 2, 3 up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to the left. So take 1 to the left and divide it by up 3, 5 to the left. What does this one say? Same thing. Take this value, okay, and divide it by 1, 2, 3 up, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to the left. There's nothing there. Excel has not done us a favor here, and we're getting divide by 0 error because there's no value there. So it's using 0, and we're trying to divide by that. This next one is doing the same thing. It's taking this value and dividing by 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to the left. I'm sorry, here, 5 to the left. It's dividing by the word region 2. Excel is telling us with pound value that that doesn't make any sense. Relative addressing is changing our formulas. It's using relative addressing. But I don't want it to change this. The goal for every single week is the exact same value. How do I tell Excel that, hey, when you copy this formula, I don't want you to mess with the C2. I want the C2 to stay the same. You use what's called absolute addressing. So far we've seen relative addressing. Now we're going to see absolute addressing. Absolute addressing means absolutely positively use the C2, leave it alone. Only when you copy the formula. It doesn't change the results of the formula. It only allows us to copy a formula that has an absolute value in it, an absolute reference. To change the C2, to give Excel the clue that we want this one locked in and you're in charge here. Okay, I want this one locked in. You go to the address bar or the formula bar up here and you click anywhere near the C2, around it, inside it. I like inside, it makes me feel a little more comfortable. And then you press the magic key, F4. When you press the F4 key, Excel automatically inserts $signs around the C and the 2. This is called an absolute reference. Excel, when you copy that formula, will update the G5, which is what we want, the one cell to the left, but it will always use C2, this goal, in every single formula when we copy it. So let's find out. Take that down. And I trust myself this time. So there we go. And all of these percentages look pretty darn good. They're all in range. Okay. So they're all in range. This is working. If we look at this formula, notice that the G6 has changed. It said take this total, one cell to the left, take the total for this row, and divide by C2. Take the total for this row, G7, divide by C2. That's absolute referencing. The biggest question that I get from beginning users of Excel is how do I know when to use absolute referencing versus relative referencing? I think the easy answer is to simply use relative addressing, and when you copy the formula, if you don't get the right results, you must need an absolute reference someplace. Right? That's one way to deal with it, but as you gain a little bit more experience, you'll recognize that if multiple copies of a formula all share the same value, they're all using C2, you need an absolute reference. If you can, and after a little bit of experience creating lots of formulas, if you use Excel on a regular basis, you'll start to recognize those things. But the one thing I want you to remember is that absolute referencing is only used to allow you to copy formulas and not have to modify them. Imagine what a pain it would have had to been to this was C3, or yeah, that was C3 and this was C4 before I changed them to absolute references. What a pain it would have been to have to go through each one of those and change them back to C2. Because there's quite a few rows here, 100 rows. And what if there were 1,000, 10,000 rows? You wouldn't want to change every single formula to make it match. That would be too tedious. The only thing absolute referencing is used for is to allow you to copy formulas. It doesn't change the formula's results in any way. It simply allows you to copy formulas without having to modify every single copy of that formula to put the value back to, in this case, C2. Another thing we could calculate is a percent of total. Right. Now here we could come down to the bottom here. Let's do that. We'll do the end down arrow. I didn't press the shift key. Notice where it jumped to the last value. And I could put a total in here and say the grand total sales. And Excel is once again smart enough to say you probably want these, right? Sounds good. We sold 446,000 and change units. Now this formula isn't very good here. We'll take that one away. And that's the total. It did that for us automatically because it saw a formula here, said maybe you want that formula, I'll copy it down for you. In this case, I didn't. There's 446 total. Right. Each week, how much of that total did we sell? So that's a percent of total. Excel has a brand new feature called Quick Analysis Tool. If I highlight all of my percentages, and again I could use Shift N to be a little quicker, but notice this little button pops up, and this is new in Excel 2013. It's called the Quick Analysis button. Notice the shortcut key, Control Q. If I click on that, it gives me all kinds of options. We're going to use this a little bit later to do charts in the next unit. We can use it to add conditional formatting. You can do it for all kinds of things, but one of the other things that's on the list here is totals. If we click on totals, notice we've got a bunch of different kinds of different totals that we can create quick analysis of, sums, averages, counts, how many of them were there. And there's a percent of total. This percent of total, however, is for this way. I want a percent of total going in my column. So if I scroll over, there's a percent of total over here. Okay. And now I can look at those numbers and see that on this day or in this week, 85%, 0.85%, very small percentage, Okay, 0.85% of my total was created during this week. What might be even more valuable is to find out what percent of total each one of my regions did. Okay, so here's my total. And so if I highlight these, actually I need the totals down here, so I'm going to copy this. Okay, and this one did 87, this one did 89, 87, 91. These are all pretty close, but if I wanted to, I could now highlight these and do a quick analysis and say, give me the percent of total working across. Okay, so here's my percent of total, and I can see that this one is exactly 20%. These are 19, those the rest are pretty close, and this one's a little bit higher, so they're all close. But if we look at these are actually formulas, by the way. If you watch the autofill series, this is not a series, this is actually a formula. Okay? And notice it uses absolute references. Because when it calculates the percent of total, it's using this, and it's actually calculating its own total, but it's using an absolute reference. If we look at these, this is this number divided by the sum of all of these, and notice that each one of those is an absolute reference. Just for information purposes, I'm going to highlight all these cells again. Quick reference also includes a running total. Okay, so here's my quick analysis tool, and I can do a total, and I want to do a running total going down the side. And it asked me if I want to replace it. It'd be kind of nice if I could put it in this cell. Let's cancel that, shift it over one. Okay, notice all the formulas are absolute, so it keeps up with me. Okay, now I can highlight these again. I'm getting tired of doing that. Shift end. Okay, and now I want to do the quick analysis, and I want the running total for the column. So here's the totals. I want them up and down. There's the running total. Notice that each one of these, sum, average, count, percent, and running total, are all duplicated, one for across and one for up and down. And notice as I touch them, I see the values. So here's the running total. Fortunately, those are formatted as percents, so now I need to go change those. Control home. And in here, go with the end again, shift down arrow. Let's just change these to comma format, and then we should be about done. That's not quite right. Oh, I totaled these. I should have been totaling those. Darn. Delete them all. Let's see what happens if I can get it right here. Shift down arrow, and I want to do a quick analysis. I hope it doesn't wipe out. It tends to want to put it in the next column. If there's a downside, that's the downside. Wants to put it in the next column, and I already have data there. Do I want to replace it? Not really. I kind of like these percentages. So let's insert another column here and do that one more time. This time I'm going to go the other direction, shift and up arrow. It takes me a little too far. Still holding the shift key down. If I come down, it takes the total off. And then finally do the quick analysis. Running total columns, and it starts adding them all up, and I can see how much sales I've had each week as a running total. But in order to do a running total, once again, there's a G5. Okay. Take a sum of G5 to G5, so it starts, every one of these formulas starts at G5 to the current cell, adds them all up. So take G5 all the way down to here, add them up. Take G5 all the way down to here. It's another use of an absolute reference. One other thing to remember is that absolute references, your formulas, are never 100% absolute references. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Or very, let me just say rarely, I shouldn't say never. They're rarely completely absolute references. This one has one absolute reference, and this is still a relative reference. This formula, percent of goal, has a relative reference divided by an absolute reference. If there were two absolute references, every single formula would have the same value. That doesn't usually work, isn't usually what you want. So your formulas are going to be a mix of absolute references and relative references. Some people get a little carried away with the absolute references, so I'm going to duplicate this formula one more time. And I'm going to say take this value and divide it by that value. And at this point, notice where the cursor is. It's on C2 over here. Oops. Move my mouse the way I didn't want to. Click on C2 again. Made a mess. Delete that, start over again. Equals this one divided by C2. My cursor is on the C2. So I can press F4 right now because I know that needs to be an absolute reference. One of the things you need to see is that you can also press F4 again. And notice it took the $sign off the C. Right? That would allow me to update the column but not the row when I copy this formula. If I press F4 again, the $sign goes on the C, but now it's off the 2. Lock in the column, but go ahead and update the row. And finally, another F4 takes them out altogether, and then it just goes back around in that circle. Right. In this case, my 4,000, is always in column C. And my total is always going to be, my percent of goal is always going to be in column J. So technically, I could do this. That'll still work. Those are called partial absolute references. Those are a lot less commonly used. So I wouldn't worry about them. What I normally do is make everything an absolute reference and then and then if I need to, I'll take a look and maybe make them partial, but they're pretty rare. Most absolute references are completely absolute. Finally, if you wish, you can type the $signs. I'm typing them instead of pressing F4. I prefer the F4 key. It puts them in there and it's much quicker. But you can type the $signs. There's nothing magical about them. If you decide that it shouldn't be an absolute reference anymore, you can use the arrow keys and take the $signs out manually if you wish. I just use the F4 key until they disappear. All right, so finally, one more time, absolute references are used to copy formulas, but leave parts of the formula alone. In this case, the C2. Everybody shares that value. In this case, where's the beginning of the list? It's in G5. Everybody shares the beginning of the list, G5. So the G5 is absolute. Everybody shares that in their formula. It's a sum of what? Everything from G5 down to my row, G16. Right? Everybody shares those. Everybody shares the G5. Everybody shares the C2. If all the copies of a formula share a value, you need to make it absolute so that you can quickly copy that formula. Hope that clears up the difference between relative addressing and absolute addressing, and it should save you a lot of time in your homework assignments updating some of those formulas where absolute references go. As an evil instructor, I put as many absolute references in there as I can to make sure you get practice with them.